Hey everybody, Ryan Sage from Formula Drift here. Wanted to make a quick video. Well, maybe it won't be so quick, but we realized after Long Beach and then also following Road Atlanta that with our new rule book and with some of the events that transpired, particularly with Shanahan and Turk and Long Beach, and then probably the three most controversial battles in Road Atlanta, LZ Field, Sorensen, Bakchis, Charpentier, that we probably needed to have at least a resource or a more full-throated way to explain what it is that we're doing in this year's rule book and this year's practices and things like that. And it's just not enough to do a podcast, individual video posts, press releases, expect fans to read the rule book, et cetera, et cetera. And so I wanted to take an opportunity to kind of do that. And I was a little bit inspired by trying to get one of the judges to do a post Road Atlanta in particular, kind of battle breakdown. Didn't really have a lot of success with that. The judges are not full-time employees and they don't live in this state, and some not even in this country. But I've made arrangements to do that following Orlando. I think we'll make that a regular part of what we do, just at least on the judging side. So what we've been working on the past couple of weeks, I guess 2 weeks, 17 days since Road Atlanta, is trying to compile 3 or 4 of the top most asked questions or questions that are related to things that people are talking about. And then we thought it would be a good idea to kind of take those questions and lay them over the 3 most controversial battles at Road Atlanta. And in particular, what's interesting about that is those 3 battles have been appealed. And so I want to talk about the appeals process that's been in place for years. And then what was prior to that, the protest, which was the in-event protest. So I'll kick things off with the questions first, and then we'll talk about those individual battles. I'm going to try to stay away from like being a judge myself. Everything that's on the record for judging, I'll make sure to talk about, but I won't put any of my individual opinions in there, just like the facts on the ground and how the judges judge it and things like that. And we'll see where we go. All right, so let's kick things off. Question number 1. Why did you rework what is and what is not an incomplete? Okay, so this one is kind of a big one, I think, because it's been something that's been a work in progress for pretty much all 21 years of the sport. In the early days of drifting, 2 tires off was incomplete, and it was 3 tires off. What counted as a straightening was basically down to the judge's opinion. Sometimes people use the word noticeable, paused. Never really has anybody ever put some time to it, because time doesn't really help that much, depending on how the speed is, but it's a good general, approximation. It's one of the reasons why we've gone in that direction. You can imagine the difference between doing a straightening for half of a second at 90 miles per hour versus half of a second at 25 miles per hour. It's a pretty big difference, much more noticeable, right? Okay, so the reason why we reworked them to where they are now in this year's rule book is because for years, all of the incompletes that have been on the margin, and the one even that is the most tied to drifting, i.e. straightening, has always been debated, argued, and looked at as something that did not have the proper equivalence to be judged as an incomplete. And an incomplete used to be called a 0. And so what an incomplete is basically a non-scored run. And in tandem, why that's relevant is because you get an incomplete and the other driver has 2 scored runs, you're automatically going to lose that battle. And so what our goal was to do is to basically try and take all of the incompletes that no rational person would disagree with, that everybody considers to be the thing that happens when you stop drifting, by definition, and to make those our absolute incompletes. And then to make all of the things that have been argued over years, we have literally hundreds of examples of them, and I'll pick up on a couple of them, and make those things judged. They could be judged minorly, moderately, severely, so severe you can't come back from it unless the other driver incompletes. And our goal was to basically try and find all of those examples of the absolute incompletes, and that those would be our new incompletes, and that everything else would be judged. And those are things like spinning out. Nobody disagrees about that. Stopping drifting. And there's got to be some definition to what stopping drifting is. Everybody agrees that if you're mid-drift and you stop and the wheels go to 0 degrees and you slow down at 50% and it's clearly you're not participating in the run anymore, that is considered stopping drifting. You're not drifting anymore. You're in incomplete. Everybody pretty much agrees that an opposite drift for no matter what period of time, as long as it can be seen, is pretty much an incomplete. But though I have seen people argue against that. And so we've basically taken all of the incompletes that we have that nobody disagrees with, and tried to make them the ones that everybody does agree with. And just go back to last year, you can see examples of disagreements. Was Dylan Hughes 3 tires off on the St. Louis Excerpt or not? Did the guy, did his hood pop up in New Jersey? Yes, it did. Okay, should that be an incomplete? Or his trunk pop up? So these are the kind of things where when you learn your lesson for the 10,000th time, did somebody straighten here? Did he not straighten? And you get just a library book full of protests, whether or not they're valid, whether or not they meet the standard, you kind of start to realize that you're missing the point a little bit of what this is supposed to be. There are clearly things that should be counted as an incomplete because you are literally not doing the thing that you're being asked to do. And then there are things on the margin, like, are there 3 tires off right here? It might be 1 inch off, but if we have to look at 5, 6, 7, 8 replays, and pull up every possible angle and spend 10 minutes burning time just to look at an incomplete, when that run was perfect otherwise, and the guy that he was going against was subpar or average, everybody still thinks that the guy that dropped 1 inch of the 3rd tire off of St. Louis should win. And it does not sit well with people. That person is going to lose if it turns out that the judges see that 1 inch went off of, the painted line or onto the grass or whatever. Meanwhile, the other guy wasn't doing well. So that was our goal with the incompletes. And when it comes to straightening, straightening has always been something that has been the most difficult to judge because it really depends on what you think a straightening is constituted of. Every car, when they do a transition, goes to 0 degrees for some microsecond period of time, barely even noticeable. Sometimes there's a slight pause, like on the exit to, say, Seattle, for example, when you're coming off the bank, you're going basically in a power alley where you are this way and then swinging back around, and here you are, and then you're going to that next outer zone. And there's a period of time there where some cars will settle and then go to the other side. And the more exaggerated that gets, the more noticeable it gets. And where that line is quite difficult. Now, if you're driving on the bank at opposite lock and your wheels come to 0 degrees, that's much easier to see, especially if you're not in the smoke line. And if it looks like you did straighten for a noticeable period of time, as long as you know what it means to be noticeable, then you can look at that as an incomplete. And that's one of the reasons why we had gone with the 2-second rule. Now, there'll be a little asterisk here is that after every event, we always look at things that we feel like need to be adjusted. And right now we're on version 1.3 of the judging regulations. So some of these things are being fine-tuned and detailed. But the general question being asked here is a good one, is why did we adjust incompletes in such a way? Well, we want more runs to be completed without having the judges' hands handcuffed to give an automatic incomplete for the things that we feel are marginal. And that we know we're marginal because other people tell us that, and we observe that, and the teams are the ones that are protesting it, et cetera, et cetera. And so when you have that kind of system, it allows you to see the runs fully completed. It allows the drivers that made one minor mistake by dropping that 3rd tire to still otherwise get the win when the other driver that they were competing against was driving average or subpar. And it makes it more aligned with your intuitions. The problem is, and the problem that we've experienced is that usually what ends up happening because it's formula drift is the person that makes one of those marginal mistakes will be in a battle where the other person actually incompleted, and people's intuitions will say, well, that used to be an incomplete, that guy get an incomplete, they should both get incompletes. I'm here to tell you that that really hasn't happened so far this year. It happened in one occasion at Road Atlanta, and it's not the battles that you think about. It wasn't Matt Field or anything like that, and I'll explain that later on. But that's the reason why we've done that. We've tried to make it as acceptable to the general public on what constitutes an incomplete or an unscored run, and let everything else be judged by the judges on the severity relative to what happens in each battle. All right, question number 2, why did you get rid of protests? Would having a protest have helped LZ, Rome, or Sorensen? Okay, the reason we got rid of protests is because the way that we've reworked the rule book is we've reincorporated all of the things that have been protested and the things that have won protests into the rule book in such a way that protests are not needed anymore. Now, in right here, I have all the protests from 2023, okay? Most of these are denied, have been denied for very good reason, and I'll explain that to you. And there was 4 that got through. The 4 that got through met the standard of what a protest is or was. The standard of a protest, and you can find this in the old rule book, but it's also the exact same language of the appeals process, is that it must be something that can be demonstrated to be objectively true and also incontrovertible, and that had it been factored into the run, would have changed the outcome of the run. So if somebody protests and said, he had lower angle than me, I was closer for a longer period of time, he missed outside zone number 2, that is a judge's interpretation and therefore not a protestable item that meets the standard. If somebody says that such and such driver had a trunk lift up when I was chasing him, or the trunk lifted up and I wasn't chasing him, okay? And it says that if your hood pops up or something latchable comes off, it constitutes an incomplete, and that wasn't factored into the judge's result, then that is something that could be protestable. Now, do people like the fact that a chase driver's trunk can pop up and the lead driver doesn't even see it, and that person gets an incomplete in the chase? No, nobody likes that. What you would accept is that if the trunk popped up and it was the lead driver, and you could make a case that it had an effect on the chase driver, meaning that the chase driver was in proximity, it probably distracted him, et cetera, and that's already covered in this year's rulebook. If the trunk pops up and the guy's 10 car lengths ahead going across the finish line, and on a technicality, his trunk pops up and the chase driver spotter sees it, is that something that we should have be protestable? No, we shouldn't, because it didn't affect the chase driver. He was already so far behind. Now, the protests that actually were valid and came through and changed the outcome really were things that could be objectively identified, such as a driver decelling, right? The red light coming on, which is a decel is a technical term that we have in the rulebook that has a mathematical definition that is tied into the telemetry. If a lead driver decelled in a non-decel area and the spotter didn't think that it was factored in, and the chase driver perhaps had to put on the brakes and there was a gap or something like that, but it was hard to see because there was smoke. But if you look at this camera angle, you might be able to make the case that technically the red light came on in a non-decel area and it had an impact. If you can do all that, then you can protest and you can win the protest and potentially get the battle rerun or have a one more time, or maybe even win, depending on what occurs in that particular instance. That's an example of something that transpired last year that was protested. It was legit and it looked like it had an effect. And so the battle was run one more time, or the second half was run one more time.
Rightfully so. Basically, there was a protest that was submitted and it is being accepted and approved. Therefore, A battle will be reran after further review, and this fell on the shoulders of Sean Adriano and driver Stuart Brian Eggert. I'm going to pass it over to you, Ryan Sage, and elaborate, because we are going to see Odie Bakchis and Chris Forsberg rerun. Elaborate, if you will.
Yeah, I'll just tell you a little bit about the process. All protests must be submitted prior to the result of the subsequent battle. And Chris Forsberg's team protested what was kind of talked about a little bit in terms of the decel portion of outside zone 1. Now, the way a protest works is it is completely out of the judge's hands. A protest comes into the stewards. The stewards either accept it or don't accept it. If they accept it, they have to both agree on what the conclusion of the protest is. If they don't agree, the run stands. So now let's bring in Brian Eggert, who was one of the stewards with Sean Adriano, to tell us what happened.
As you can see in the run here, what they basically protested was Odie's lights coming on in a non-decel zone according to the decel map. And as you saw there, right between the 2 and 1 cone, the lights do come on the windshield red. So clearly there was a decel that was there. What we did was then we looked at what was also happening with Forsberg's car, and as we saw, we kind of went with the fact of shared fault, because Forsberg was still accelerating pretty heavily prior to that happening. So basically we put shared fault on both drivers for that incident there. As a result of that, that run gets washed. The tricky part is going into the second run, where we would normally judge under that. Odie and his team would basically be under the impression, based on the first call, that that was an incomplete because the judges had assigned fault to Forsberg for that hit. So we felt that that second run wasn't truly based on how it should have gone down, where he wasn't driving like a 100% run for that. So we decided to just go ahead and wash the whole thing and do it one more time for both drivers and get a clean run from both guys and have a fair battle here for the advancing driver.
I think it was a pretty clean-cut explanation.
Other things that were protestable that also won were examples of straightening, right? So we would have on the bank, in Seattle, there would be a driver that was in the chase position, and they would be getting covered by smoke, and they would be at full lock, and for a second they would come to 0 degrees and then go back. The protesting team doesn't know whether or not the judges saw it, because the judges are not necessarily the ones talking on the microphone at all time. It's the announcers, and the announcers are trying to do the best that they can to be able to get what the judges are judging on. And sometimes it gets through and sometimes it doesn't. Now, if the team doesn't know, or if the team didn't hear, and they see that the driver they're competing against had a straightening in their mind, they want to know if it was factored in. So they're going to protest. And what the result of that is going to be is, we saw that, we didn't think it was that much of a straightening or had an impact on the run or met the barrier of an incomplete in that year's rulebook. And so it is a valid protest, but we're not going to change anything because we did factor it in. If it was, you know what, we saw that, but we didn't think it was severe. But now that we've looked at it from this camera angle, that did meet the definition of that year's rulebook as an incomplete. And so you are correct. This is something that we could objectively identify. It's a question that's true or false. And it's true that that person straightened by that definition of the rule book. And so therefore you are going to win your protest. There were 4 of those out throughout the entire year. There's 26, 27 pages here. Most of them are on judges' interpretations. We don't allow protests on judges' interpretations. It has to be something that the body of people that are doing the protest, i.e. the driver's steward and the steward's assistant, which is one of the judges that wasn't judging that event, can look at that independently and say, yes, it is a true or false statement or question, and it can be objectively identified, and it's incontrovertible. Most of the time, say 95% of the time, it's all about debating the judge's interpretation of the run itself, not about in a specific instance. So when we look at the protests that were actually valid on the basis of that standard and that got overturned, every single one of those items we've reincorporated back into the rule book in some way to be judged. We've softened what it means to be straightening. We've taken out how many tires off course is an incomplete, because even 3 tires off has been debated ad nauseum. And we allow the judges to make a distinction at each individual track where it may not look as bad that 3 tires were off, or that even 4 tires were off, like at the case of the triangle at Road Atlanta. I believe they're probably going to go with 4 tires off for the majority of the tracks is an incomplete. But still, if somebody goes 3 tires off and the other guy, all other things being equal, was the same, the guy that had the 3 tires off is going to lose, right? That's the bottom line. So that's one of the reasons why we've got rid of protests, but it's not the only reason. The other reason is because all of the protests that we have had generally come and have an impact that becomes noticeable to the broadcast and to the live event fans. When we get a protest in the top 32, nobody really ever knows unless it's overturned, right? And an example of that would be you would see a car or cars come out at the top 16 because a protest was being adjudicated during halftime. In the top 16, you still may not notice unless it's the last battle at the top 16 and the protest has to be in prior to the next the start of the next battle. So whether it's the beginning of the grade 8 or the next battle in the top 16. And, you know, we might have to wait a second to review that before we move on into the grade 8. In the grade 8 and the final 4, if it's in the second half of the bracket, we literally cannot move on because we will find ourselves in a pinch if we have to adjudicate a protest and something happens, because you literally have 2 battles in the final 4. If the winner of the left-hand side was in the previous bracket in the grade 8, if that is being protested, it's the next battle up basically, or the other battle up. And so we don't have a full final 4 until that protest gets adjudicated. And that's exactly what happened last year in St. Louis, where we burned 35 minutes going through a protest. It was legitimate. We did rerun the second half of it, but we burned 35 minutes in the meantime, tap dancing during a live television broadcast, which we are still having to do this year or still doing this year. And the result ended up being the same anyways. So then we take the elements of that protest and we say, how do we put this into the rule book so that that can't happen anymore? And so that's the second reason why we have decided to get rid of protests, is that everything that was protestable, everything that did win a protest is now factored into the rule book in a way to be judged. And it gets rid of a lot of the really like nitpicky protests that are technically protestable, may be technically true, may or may not have been seen by the judges, and may or may not have even made a difference in the battle. You put that into the rule book and now you don't need protests. If there is something that is missed by that process that we've done, then we have appeals. But I can tell you, from Long Beach to Road Atlanta and every other battle we've seen for the past 20 years, nothing that I can see so far would have benefited from a protest. And so that's the other reason why we don't have them anymore. Knowing all of that, would a protest have helped LZ, Rome, or Sorensen? So no, it would not have helped LZ because that entire battle is a judge's interpretation. Doesn't matter about the in-car camera from Adam, that wouldn't have been made into the protest. Anyways, a protest can only use things that we have readily available to us in competition. So it has to be fair for everybody. Just because it happens in the top 32 and we could go pull telemetry data or we could go look at an in-car cam under those old rules from previous years, we have to treat it the same for everybody. If everybody gets to have their telemetry taken care of and pulled out, if everybody gets to bring in their GoPros, if everybody gets to bring in their own camera guy, we are never going to finish the competition. And it's going to be unfair because people are different or have different levels of resources. So in a protest, it has to be able to use things that we have on our production truck or that we have readily available. And so in that sense, even if LZ and Rome were not subjective judges' interpretations, there was nothing there that could have been used either. Anyways, there's nothing there that would have said that something happened that was objectively true that wasn't factored into the run. It's a protest is not about taking a second look. We've already taken 20 looks, right? If it's something that we know is going to be controversial, the judges are definitely going to look at it. But the basis for a protest in the event means that whatever we have access to in real time, readily available, all the camera shots, all the drones, the lights on the cars, et cetera, that could have been used in a protest. Since none of that was relevant to LZ and to Rome and even Sorensen, none of those battles even though they could have turned in the paper, would have helped in a protest at all. And the reason why I mentioned Sorensen at the end is because his does have something that meets the standard of a protest, but only because Odie's decel lights were not working. Now, in previous years, if we were judging whether or not a call was being made on did driver A decel or did driver B go too fast or whatever to cause the collision, those things could be protested. But with the institution of the lights, they don't have to be protested because it can be carried out on course. Question about whether or not somebody decelled causing a contact can be seen from the lights. The fact that Odie's lights were not working is only problematic in the judgment itself in real time, because even if we didn't have the lights, the telemetry data in previous years was not something that we had readily available to us. So you could not use telemetry data, stop the show, go down, pull the telemetry data, send it up to the truck, try to figure out how to make a graphic for it, say, or take my word for it. Yeah, no, he didn't decel. It just doesn't work. That's why the lights are so important. But in the Sorensen protest, 100%, that is totally appealable because they're going to want to know whether or not Odie decelled, and we'll talk about that later. But the general gist of it is that neither in LZ's run or Rome or Sorensen would have benefited from an in-event protest. And that takes us to our next question. What is an appeal and how is that different? So an appeal is the exact same standard as a protest. It's got to be something that can be true or false, objectively identifiable and incontrovertible, meaning no rational person would say that it's false if it was true, and vice versa. But what else happens is that now the entire scope of all of the potential data points can be brought in, and a team can utilize those to make a claim or a case on something that could be looked at as objective. So let's go to Sorensen and Odie first. It's very clear that because Odie's lights were not working and the judge's claim was that he did not decel, therefore did not cause the collision, that is a true or false statement. We have a principle of decel that is a mathematical definition. When the lights go red, that's proprietary to FD. And if those lights go red and it's in a non-decel zone and somebody hits you, all other things being equal, meaning that person's not going 10x faster than they should, you are going to get the blame there. So the judges said that Odie was not decelling, and everybody was upset about that because he was on the brakes, he was left foot braking, and there was a moment of punctuated smoke line indicating that he was off throttle. And then there was the contact and the incomplete that occurred. So it's a really good thing to appeal, even though it couldn't have been protested in the live event. It's a great thing to appeal because the lights were not functioning for Odie, and it would have been settled on course there, but now there's an open question about whether or not the judges were right. Well, it turns out this is one of the appeals that is finished, so I can talk about it. Odie, in fact, and the judges are very well aware of this, and so is everybody that is a pro driver in the series or that follows, is that left foot braking is the norm. And when you get off the throttle in certain areas, particularly with these cars, you are not going to be having a defined decel, especially in particular areas of the course. It really does take the judge's kind of eyes to see that visual decel, and that just comes with training over the years and from lots of mistakes, right? There was a battle in Erie with Odie as well, where we said that he was decelling, and we didn't have the lights back then, but he made an appeal. And we looked at that data. He, in fact, wasn't decelling. The other driver, who was Von Gittin Jr. at the time, was coming in at a closing rate speed. That's why speed is important for us in what we're trying to do in telemetry version 2. He was coming in with slightly higher speed, and he was also coming in on a slightly tighter angle. and a tighter line. And the combination of those two things compared to the consistency of Odie, even though Odie had a punctuated smoke line for a second, was what caused the contact. So the judges said Odie was decelling. He in fact wasn't decelling. It was Vaughn that was speeding up. We also saw that with Vaughn and Chelsea in Long Beach, where Chelsea pulled some e-brake coming from outside zone 2 to 3, and then Vaughn slammed into him. They gave Chelsea, the judges gave Chelsea the fault, or 2 of the 3 judges gave Chelsea the fault, because everybody could see the e-brake, and they just see Vaughn, driving and wrecking into him. E-brake, the intuition there is e-brake and collision, therefore e-brake equals the fault for collision or the cause of the collision. Wrong. In the telemetry data, Vaughn was going about 8 miles per hour faster, and there was no effect in decel from Chelsea whatsoever, because that's just the way that modern drift cars run. So going back to the Odie battle, exact same situation here. We pulled the telemetry data, and the appeals committee looked at it, and sure enough, Odie had consistent speed through there, and he was not decelling. On the other hand, Sorensen was going upwards of 6 miles per hour faster with slightly less angle and a slightly tighter line. And that is the overwhelming reason why there was a collision there, not because there was a decel from Odie. And so therefore that protest was denied. It was a very well-written protest, super professional. They did all the right things, multiple pages. I saw copies of it once the appeals process was done, and they did a great job. Okay, now let's go to LZ and Matt Field. Okay, so first of all, the way that it was judged, I think, is really important there. So it was one more time, Matt Field, Matt Field. The reason why it was one more time, Matt Field, is because all 3 judges gave Matt Field and LZ an incomplete on run 2. Matt for his large straightening and, the kind of the, I guess it was an opposite drift going up. Yeah, there it is. Opposite drift going up or understeer in that area, whatever. It's a big, big mistake. All 3 judges gave that incomplete. And then we had the contact from Matt, and then subsequently we had LZ shutting it down. Now I'm using that term shutting it down because that has now become the reality of this situation. And at the time in real time, we did not know that. What the judges had looked at is that contact had been made during the transition. LZ made the transition, started going down the hill, and about 160 feet later, the car stopped. And, I'm sitting right behind Reese Marin, who's one of our 2 new judges, and he literally had his finger on the LZ button right after Matt Field incompleted behind LZ. And then as soon as the contact was made and we saw LZ shut down, then all of a sudden he put his hands up like this, like, oh, great, here we go again. So with that one, it was appealed as well. There were a number of different provisions that they looked at in the rule book to bring to attention. Most of them either did not apply to the battle or they were about things that no longer existed in the rule book or that were in the sporting regulations, which is not the sporting regulations is different than the judging regulations. Sporting regulations is about behavior in the paddock and how to conduct yourself as a professional and so forth. It's not about what things can be checked in an appeal or with judging. The bottom line with that one is that ultimately there is nothing there that could have allowed LZ to appeal. He could have turned in the paper, of course, that's fine. Nobody's stopping them from turning in the paper, but there's nothing there that would have made it valid and therefore looked at to be protestable. And that's what we need to have in order for something to have the benefit of a protest. And really the long and short of that whole thing is that ultimately the judge's intuitions were validated the moment that LZ acknowledged that he stopped on purpose. And he said it multiple times in the broadcast and also on videos and blah, 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 blah. So the case that they would have to make is that when he said that, the most important part of that whole battle was the fact that in that drivers' meeting and in the first drivers' meeting of the year in Long Beach, the judges have explicitly stated, and particularly at Road Atlanta because there's so much contact, that if you are made contact with, you are to do your best to try to continue to keep driving. And to let the natural effect of the contact play out and not to take an easy win or to prevent flopping, et cetera, et cetera. And, that is just to allow them to be able to see the natural impact. And I'm not saying that anybody in the series is a serial flopper or anything like that. My belief is that everybody tries to drive hard, but there's a lot of people that do think that. And the judges don't want to see you get an easy win or throw your hands up just because you're made contact with. And we see very heavy contact. We see light contact. They have a lot of differences in effect. If you hit a wheel at angle, or if you hit a rear quarter panel, or if you just cause cosmetic damage or whatever, the judges want to see the natural impact of any contact that takes place. And they judge that run to be something that did not look like it was the effect of the contact that Matt had made, even though Matt was at fault for that contact. The moment that LZ acknowledged that he did that on his own volition, so to speak, with his own agency, it's a straightforward contradiction of the demand that's being asked in the driver's meeting. And so I don't know if LZ spotter was in the driver's meeting, or LZ didn't hear this, or whatever the case may be. But saying that you did the thing that the judges told you not to do is not going to help you if you're trying to lodge a protest on something that has to be objective and incontrovertible and a true statement. So there's nothing there in that protest, that potential protest that people were asking for, that LZ would have been able to appeal to. Now, in his appeal, he tried to basically, point to various areas in the rule book, but none of them really applied. We really wanted to see a case to be made that the contact that Matt made was the cause that led to the effect of him stopping. But in the middle there, he says that he stopped on his own. And so the appeals board is essentially, their hands are tied, because the reason, the finding out the reason why he stopped is already known. The reason why he stopped is because he stopped on his own volition for safety and a bunch of other reasons that he thought was justified. That doesn't change the fact that that was a demand that the judges were asked, and the judges can't contradict their own demands. Otherwise, the other side could actually appeal the decision. The other part to be noticed here is that when you appeal in a post-event situation, you are not supposed to talk about the battle in the general media or public. And the reason for that is because you can very easily create a situation, even though if I don't think it would do anything, that appears to prejudice the appeals, right? And we don't want to prejudice the appeals process. We use very much like a court style type system that comes from the former group that we were sanctioned by. And, we're part of the FIA Drifting Commission, which is, we have to be a member of ACUS and so forth, and da-da-da-da. And so, we try to follow very much like a court style system. And so you're not supposed to say things in public. Now, he was interviewed in the live stream. That's no problem. He made his post. Okay, maybe you could kind of like, say that's not that big of a deal. He's asking for help. Help me get a protest. But, he should have known that there was nothing in there that could be protested. In his big video, he says, I'm robbed and all this kind of stuff, and makes a, his case in there. But still, the body of evidence is showing that he's acknowledging that he's the one that made the car stop. So there's nothing really that can be done in real time under the previous protest rules or in the appeal. And what the appeals committee wanted to see is to make a case unequivocally that it was the contact that was the result of him stopping. But again, like I said, he acknowledges that he stopped on his own volition. So it's kind of done and over. If there was something there, he would put the appeals committee in a really tough situation, because he did talk about it publicly in a very, very, known kind of way, a very public kind of way. And what could potentially happen there is, let's say there was something, they made a great case. They're like, here's our case, and here's the thing that's objective and all this kind of stuff, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And let's just say it got overturned, or we added points or gave him the victory or something like that. The counterparty could say, hold on a second. The very first statement in the appeals is that you should not talk about it public. He did talk about it in public. Why are you guys allowing that to happen against your own rules? So now we've got a secondary contradiction. Thankfully, there's nothing that could have been protested, nothing in the appeal that was shown to be of the standard of the appeal or the case that needed to be seen. And even if there was, he talked about it publicly, we would have to object to it outright, or the appeals committee would have to basically throw it away, essentially, because it would violate their own rules, knowing how public of a situation it was. Okay, whatever, you know, that is what it is. There's nothing really there. So that's two battles that really could not have benefited from a protest. The Rome one is the only one of the three. It still could not have been protested, right? Because the judges are judging a behavior of a vehicle, and the hits that Odie made, they said bump and tap are the terms that they used. And that, you know, that Rome should have been able to drive away from it, so to speak. That's all fine and good, because basically that is essentially a judging call. But, you know, think about what we have in the physical picture, and this appeal is still pending. This is one that has not been resolved because there is a plethora of not just data, but cameras and all kinds of other third-party material that has been presented to the appeals committee to look at. Because what an appeal covers is everything that we could possibly get our hands on to turn over to the appeals committee, or everything that the team could provide. The team has their own cameras. We can verify that those haven't been manipulated. We actually have our own cameras. We have GoPros in and on the car, and we have Type S cameras that we require in the car that were mounted and functional in his car. Those were not functional or mounted in LZ's car. And then we have all of the telemetry data. So I just want to stop there and say that that's kind of the difference that we're seeing. And it's still an open appeal because of all of the data provided. Sorensen's was super easy. LZ's really didn't have a standard either way, and they didn't make a case for the most important thing. And Rome's is the one that is the most complicated, and it also has the most amount of data that has to be reviewed. But the most interesting thing for me is this. I just want you to kind of see this, because we're creating a video that talks about the adventurous day that Rome had on that Saturday. This is how it starts out. In practice, he had a pretty sizable crash with Simon Olsen, damaged the front end, had to make repairs on both sides, and we have video of all that. Okay, that's his day starts. Then he goes into the top 32 and he gets hit pretty hard. And we have the telemetry data on that. We know what kind of G impact that hit was with Diego Higa. Gets thrown off the course, spins all crazy into the kitty litter, car gets all messed up. So far, he hasn't even made a completed battle to start the day. Then he goes up against Forsberg. Forsberg loses a transmission coming towards the keyhole. He slams into him, re-damages the front end again. The car's totally messed up again. Once again, hasn't finished a set of battle runs so far, even into the top 16.
Gotta get fully beat up for sure.
Coming through here, you can hear things popping off.
Real close to Chris. We came around the upper, the keyhole, we're ready to go, and right as Chris went around the inner quid, we went to shift and went straight into neutral and just plowed into the back of the car.
Oh, the plot thickens here. Man.
Moving on to top 8, which is super crazy. I don't think I've ever made it at top 32 here, so this is awesome. This is a good run for the start of the season for sure.
Then we get to Odie. They make the first lap, and then the second lap, Odie bumps him and then taps him, goes off course, flies all over again. Then Odie explodes, and it's a total S show and crazy. So Rome's car, all through that day, had been getting absolutely hammered, and the team had been trying to make repairs along the way. He had never actually done 2 laps in competition with that vehicle from the point of practice forward. The other thing is that one of the incidents, he actually sustained an injury to his arm that we not only have in the broadcast, we have the medical records, and we also know what people oversaw him, and we also know how he was reporting the functionality of that arm. Now, he was released and allowed to drive on his own recognizance, but we have seen in the footage of that incident how he is utilizing that arm that was injured prior to that. And, you know, I don't want to speculate, but I can just tell you, when you add all of these things up together and then you look at it through the lens and you match it up with the data that we have from Odie's car, that's the reason why it is still pending and so complicated, because from the onset, it was a judge's decision, a judge's interpretation. He could have made that run. And what the team is doing is saying, I want to show you and prove to you on stuff that can actually be demonstrated to be true with data, photo, videos, and independently verifying damage to my car that it could not have happened. And that is a very, very tall order for the team to take. And that's why the appeals committee has spent 40 hours on this particular appeal to try and look at all the data. And so therefore it's still pending. But I think that it will probably be resolved within the next week or so. Everybody, even including people that don't work in our office, are headed out to Orlando. So, okay, let's keep going. Why are there more ads in the top 16 than top 32? Okay, so in top 16, we're now in live broadcast with live television. So we go to MAV TV. So we have scheduled time breaks. So we have a certain number of time breaks that we have to have that are 2 minutes and 30 seconds every single time. And we have to hit, like, I think 9 of those or something like that. And so we can hit 4 at the beginning and then like go crazy and then hit 5 at the end, or we can break those up. And we try to usually do it when there's like oil down or a crash or a competition timeout or whatever. But, you know, now that we are on live television, that means that we're going to have these kind of traditional television ad breaks. It's going to seem different than the top 32 and seating. And it's also plays an influential role in the rules to protests, to flow of show. And this is also the first year that we have dual burnout boxes at every single round. Last year we had it at certain rounds. Now we have it at every single rounds. So when you get to Irwindale, which is the hardest one to do dual burnout boxes, is because of the way it's configured, there's going to be a bridge going over from the trackside reserved into the paddock so that we can't actually have dual burnout boxes. When we can have dual burnout boxes, we can save 1 minute of downtime per every battle, which is massive. That's why these shows are going so fast. Part of that's the format. You know, we don't have 4.5-hour qualifying sessions anymore, and we've got a tandem only competition. You know, we've eliminated protests, but we've made it so that the fairness quotient went back into the rule book. Now, if we find out that something is unfair, even though Formula Drift is the only professional drifting series that does things like competition timeouts and did protests and appeals, even though we had these things as historical standards because we thought that they were good for the fairness doctrine, if it turns out that there's something that we missed, we will want to address that. But at the current moment, there's nothing that could have been protested or would have had an effect by a protest that would have changed anything in the battles that we're talking about here. What other changes did you make that are affecting the show and the broadcast? Oh, we already did that. Okay. All right, so I'm going to stop there for now. What I'd like to be able to do is I will personally answer any question that you guys want answered. I tried to record this video a couple days ago, started to think about it and realized how complicated and how long it was going to be. So I wanted to try to get to the major points. And I had today to be able to do that, which is May 28th, Tuesday. So whenever this comes out, just know that this was recorded on that day. Couple bits of inside information if you're staying this long. Version 1.3 of the judging rule books is supposed to be coming out today or tonight. There's some non-trivial clarifications in there, and then a couple added elements, provisional changes and things like that, moving things around. But there's some stuff in there that I think that you'll find interesting, particularly as it applies to straightening, so to speak. And whatever I didn't cover, I am more than happy to answer your questions. You know, there's a lot of what we do has a certain layer of complexity. I wish that wasn't the case. It just happens to be. This is a crazy dynamic sport. We are trying to be the best stewards that we can be, to be entertaining and fair, and all at the same time, and hire reputable people. We have 2 new judges this year that are getting their feet wet, but they are, come from backgrounds that are highly, highly respectable. Reese Marin, who is Chelsea Denofa's championship spotter and has been drifting pretty much all of his life and does a lot of really, really awesome, amazing things for the sport. And then we have Vernon Zvendeveld, who's a Driftmaster judge, one of the best judges I think I've ever come to see, has a great mind. And then we've got Robbie Nishida and Brian Eggert, who's probably the most tenured of the judges so far. These are all really awesome, amazing, full of integrity type people. Yes, they miss stuff from time to time. They are trying to consistently apply rules the best that they can. And I think the things that we have to do and that I have to do is say, when are they inconsistent with the rules, and when are we complaining about the effect of the rules? And if there's an overriding reason to change a rule in favor of something else, and we've looked at all of the other sides of the equation, then we can make those adjustments. I mean, we are not past looking at something saying, hey, this is just not working. But it should be understood that everything that we've put into the rulebook this year is to try and make the sport more fair, more competitive, better, quicker, faster, more palatable, more accepting for things like live television, which we would have never had we not made some of these changes. You can't have a broadcast that's 2 hours or 4 hours, and we'll let you know, and things like that. So anyways, happy to answer all the questions. There's probably a lot more. And if you guys want me to do any other kinds of videos or whatever from, this side of the table, I'm happy to do it. Otherwise, have a good one. We'll see you on the track.